Hello, it's Psychocore. We present Why We Become What We Hate, Jung Shadow. There's a moment in every person's life when they catch themselves doing exactly what they swore they'd never do. The strict parent who becomes tyrannical like their own father. The victim of bullying who finds themselves humiliating others. The person who despises liars suddenly caught in a web of their own deception. This isn't hypocrisy, it's psychology. And Carl Jung had a name for it, the shadow. The shadow isn't just a concept from analytical psychology, it's the dark twin that lives within each of us, containing everything we've rejected, denied, and pushed into the unconscious depths of our psyche. Jung discovered that the very traits we most vehemently hate in others often represent the disowned parts of ourselves. We don't just dislike these qualities, we hunt them down with the fury of someone trying to destroy their own reflection. Consider Sarah, a successful corporate executive who prided herself on honesty and integrity. She would openly criticize colleagues for their backstabbing behavior, speaking with genuine disgust about office politics and manipulation. Yet during a particularly stressful quarter, she found herself spreading rumors about a competitor for promotion, undermining their credibility with subtle comments and strategic omissions. The woman who had built her identity on being above such behavior had become exactly what she despised. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it a conscious choice. It emerged from the shadow, that repository of all the human qualities Sarah had deemed unacceptable and banished from her self-image. The shadow had been growing stronger with each denial. Each time she told herself, "I'm not like that." Each moment she felt superior to those who engaged in the very behaviors now erupting from her own unconscious. Jung understood that the shadow operates through projection. We see our own rejected qualities magnified and distorted in others. The racist who fears their own capacity for violence. The religious zealot who obsesses over the sins they secretly harbor. The perfectionist who becomes enraged at others' mistakes because they cannot tolerate their own fallibility. We create external enemies to avoid confronting the enemy within. The mechanism is elegant in its cruelty. Our conscious mind maintains its pristine self-image by casting all negative qualities onto others. We become the hero of our own story, surrounded by villains who mysteriously possess all the traits we most fear within ourselves. This psychological sleight of hand allows us to maintain our sense of moral superiority while remaining completely unconscious of our own capacity for the very behaviors we condemn. But the shadow doesn't remain passive. It grows more powerful with each denial, like a muscle that strengthens through resistance. The more vehemently we reject certain aspects of human nature, the more likely we are to be possessed by them when our psychological defenses are down. Stress, crisis, and emotional upheaval create cracks in our carefully constructed persona, allowing the shadow to emerge with devastating force. Marcus had spent his entire career fighting corruption as a prosecutor. He had built his reputation on bringing down corrupt officials, speaking passionately about justice and the rule of law. His colleagues knew him as incorruptible, a man who couldn't be bought or influenced. Yet when his daughter needed expensive medical treatment not covered by insurance, Marcus found himself accepting a bribe to throw a case. The man who had dedicated his life to fighting corruption had become corrupt himself. The tragedy wasn't just in the act itself, but in Marcus's complete inability to see it coming. He had no conscious awareness of his own capacity for corruption because he had projected it entirely onto others. In his mind, corrupt people were fundamentally different from him. They were weak, greedy, and morally deficient. He couldn't recognize that under the right circumstances, with the right pressure, he possessed the same human vulnerabilities as those he had prosecuted. This is the shadow's most insidious quality. It operates through unconscious possession rather than conscious choice. We don't decide to become what we hate. We are overwhelmed by it. The shadow erupts from the unconscious with the force of a volcanic explosion taking over our behavior while our conscious mind scrambles to rationalize and justify actions that are completely contrary to our self-image. Jung observed that the shadow often manifests most powerfully in those who have the strongest conscious commitment to being good. The person who has never acknowledged their capacity for evil is far more dangerous than someone who knows their own darkness intimately. The saint who has never wrestled with their demons is more likely to be possessed by them than the sinner who has looked their shadow in the eye. Religious and political extremism often represent shadow possession on a massive scale. The religious fanatic who preaches love while practicing hate. The political revolutionary who fights tyranny by becoming tyrannical. The social justice warrior who combats discrimination through discriminatory behavior. These individuals haven't transcended their shadow. They've been consumed by it while maintaining the illusion of moral superiority. The shadow also operates through what Jung called moral inflation, the unconscious identification with being good that makes us blind to our own capacity for evil. When we inflate our ego with moral superiority, we create a psychological pressure cooker. The more we insist on our goodness, the more we disconnect from our own humanity, and the more likely we are to be blindsided by our own capacity for the very behaviors we condemn. Lisa had always been the family peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and helped everyone get along. She prided herself on being nonviolent, often expressing disgust at people who resolved things with aggression. She had built her identity around being gentle, understanding, and diplomatic. Yet during a heated argument with her teenage son about his drug use, she found herself slapping him across the face. The woman who had never raised her hand in anger, who had always found peaceful solutions to problems, had become physically violent. The slap shocked Lisa more than it shocked her son. She had no framework for understanding her own behavior because she had never acknowledged her capacity for violence. She had projected all aggressive impulses onto others, seeing them as fundamentally different from herself. The shadow had erupted with such force that it shattered her self-image completely. This is why shadow work, the process of consciously acknowledging and integrating our rejected qualities, is so crucial for psychological health. It's not about becoming evil or embracing destructive behaviors. It's about recognizing that we contain the full spectrum of human possibilities within ourselves. The person who can acknowledge their capacity for cruelty is far less likely to be cruel than someone who believes they are incapable of it. The shadow reveals itself not just in dramatic moments of possession, but in the smaller daily manifestations of our unconscious. The way we react with disproportionate anger to certain people or behaviors. The qualities we most despise in others. The characteristics we're quickest to criticize or judge. These reactions are like psychological breadcrumbs leading us back to our own disowned parts. Jung suggested that we are most triggered by others when they embody aspects of our own shadow. The person who irritates us beyond reason, who seems to push every button we have, is often reflecting back to us the very qualities we've worked so hard to banish from our conscious awareness. Our emotional reactions become a roadmap to our own unconscious territory. The integration of the shadow doesn't mean acting out our worst impulses or abandoning our moral principles. It means developing a conscious relationship with our own darkness so that it doesn't possess us unconsciously. When we can acknowledge our capacity for greed, we're less likely to be blindsided by our own avarice. When we can admit our potential for cruelty, we can choose compassion from a place of genuine understanding rather than moral superiority. David had always been revolted by his father's alcoholism and swore he would never drink like that. He built his identity around being disciplined and controlled, taking pride in his ability to have just one drink while looking down on people who couldn't control their consumption. Yet when his marriage began falling apart and work stress intensified, David found himself drinking alone every night, hiding bottles and making excuses for his behavior. The son, who had despised his father's drinking, had become an alcoholic himself. The pattern is so common it's almost predictable. The child of an alcoholic who becomes an alcoholic, the victim of abuse who becomes abusive, the person who grew up in poverty and becomes obsessed with material wealth. We don't just repeat these patterns, we become possessed by them despite our conscious efforts to be different. The shadow operates through what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. The more extremely we position ourselves against something, the more likely we are to be pulled into it. The person who is most disgusted by sexuality often becomes sexually obsessed. The individual who is most terrified of mental illness often develops the symptoms they fear. The one who is most contemptuous of weakness often becomes weak in the very ways they despise. This isn't fate or cosmic irony. It's the natural result of psychological splitting. When we divide the world into good and evil, pure and impure, acceptable and unacceptable, we create an internal tension that eventually seeks resolution. The shadow represents all the energy we've put into rejecting aspects of ourselves, and that energy doesn't disappear. It accumulates until it finds expression. The therapeutic process often involves helping people recognize their shadow projections and begin the difficult work of integration. This doesn't mean becoming the things we hate, but rather developing a conscious relationship with our own capacity for those qualities. The recovering addict who helps other addicts isn't enabling addiction. They're using their acknowledged darkness to serve the light. Jung believed that the goal of individuation, the process of becoming whole, required embracing what he called the coincidence of opposites. We must learn to hold the tension between our light and dark aspects, recognizing that we are complex beings capable of both great good and great evil. This isn't moral relativism, it's psychological realism. The shadow often reveals itself through what we find most unforgivable in others. The qualities that make us think, "I could never do that," or "I don't understand how anyone could behave that way," are often pointing directly to our own unconscious potential. The more impossible it seems for us to understand certain behavior, the more likely we are to possess the capacity for it ourselves. Margaret worked as a child protective services worker, dedicating her life to protecting children from abuse. She felt genuine disgust toward parents who harmed their children, unable to comprehend how anyone could hurt someone so vulnerable. Yet when her own adopted daughter began displaying severe behavioral problems, Margaret found herself screaming at the child, shaking her, and feeling an almost uncontrollable urge to strike her. The woman who had spent her career protecting children from abuse had discovered her own capacity for it. This revelation didn't make Margaret an abuser, but it did force her to confront her own shadow. She had to acknowledge that under the right circumstances, with enough stress and provocation, she possessed the same human vulnerabilities as the parents she had condemned. This recognition didn't excuse abusive behavior, but it did give her a more complete understanding of human nature and her own psychological makeup. The shadow also operates through moral crusades and social movements. Often the qualities we most aggressively fight against in society represent collective shadow projections. The anti-gay politician who is secretly homosexual. The anti-drug crusader who becomes addicted to prescription medications. The feminist who becomes emotionally abusive toward men. These aren't just individual hypocrisies. They're manifestations of the shadow operating on a collective level. When we participate in moral crusades without acknowledging our own capacity for the behaviors we're fighting against, we risk becoming possessed by the very energies we're trying to eliminate. The person who fights racism while harboring their own prejudices. The individual who combats sexism while secretly resenting the opposite gender. The activist who opposes violence while engaging in verbal and emotional brutality. The shadow's power lies not in its evil nature, but in its unconscious operation. Once we can see our own capacity for the qualities we despise, we gain the power to choose our response rather than being possessed by unconscious forces. The person who acknowledges their potential for dishonesty can choose honesty from a place of genuine understanding rather than moral superiority. Jung's insight about the shadow reveals why simply trying to be good isn't enough. In fact, the more we try to be perfect, the more we risk being blindsided by our own imperfections. The shadow grows stronger in proportion to our denial of it. The person who insists they have no capacity for evil is far more dangerous than someone who knows their own darkness intimately. The integration of the shadow isn't about becoming evil or abandoning our moral principles. It's about developing a conscious relationship with our own complexity so that we can choose our actions from a place of genuine awareness rather than unconscious compulsion. When we can acknowledge our capacity for greed, we can choose generosity from a place of genuine understanding. When we can admit our potential for cruelty, we can choose kindness from a place of authentic compassion. The shadow will always be with us. It's part of what makes us human. The question isn't whether we have dark impulses, but whether we'll relate to them consciously or be possessed by them unconsciously. Jung's great discovery was that we become what we hate not because we're hypocrites, but because we're human. And only by embracing our full humanity can we hope to transcend it. The next time you find yourself filled with disgust or rage at someone's behavior, pause and ask yourself, what is this person reflecting back to me about my own capacity for similar actions? The answer might be uncomfortable, but it will also be liberating. For in acknowledging our shadow, we begin the process of becoming truly whole, not perfect, but consciously human. The shadow isn't our enemy to be defeated, but our teacher to be understood. It holds the key to our wholeness, our authenticity, and our genuine capacity for good. For only when we can look into the abyss of our own darkness can we truly appreciate the light. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share the video.